We appreciate you joining us for this last segment on the elevation certificate section C, D, and E. So we've covered A and B over the last couple of days, and so those recordings are there if you weren't able to attend those. And so these are the rest of the most frequently used and important sections. I will briefly talk about section G. It's just very seldom used, and that is for the community official to supplement information from a surveyor. So you probably won't need to use it or review that section very often. And so again, I plan to cover this slide because people may not have been able to attend our previous sessions. And so what is the elevation certificate and how is it used? So it has to be signed and sealed by a licensed surveyor or a professional engineer. We can't have architects do it in Kansas, even though that is in the instructions. We use it to support applications that claim that sites on natural ground are above the base flood elevation. And there can be a misconception with property owners or sometimes surveyors that the elevation certificate or just a survey alone will do that. We actually have to submit the application to legally take it out of the floodplain. So that's something to be aware of and let people know about. Most importantly, we use this to determine compliance with our regulations. That has not changed, while insurance is quite a bit different with the release of Risk Rating 2.0. And so an elevation certificate is now optional for flood insurance. People can submit that if they have it. Otherwise, they use the first floor height tool, which is part of the risk rating engine that they use to determine the first floor height. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that is because it's different from the lowest floor elevation definition. And if that doesn't work, they have a process to make assumptions about the first floor height based on their foundation type. So I just wanted to briefly cover that. Again, for anyone new to these sessions or someone watching down the line, the recording, the elevation certificate is planned to be updated. The current form expired yesterday, and so we're in the grace period now waiting for the new form, and it sounds like the new form is going to be delayed by an indeterminate amount of time, but I will send a follow-up email when it's released to everyone that has attended these sessions, so you have a notification that it has changed and the new form has been released, and then that's what we should be using when it does come out. And so just keep an eye out for that. And so paperwork is important to our community. I'm covering this again because we are covering section C most importantly this morning. And that is where some of the most important information about the structure is located. These are the actual survey shots. And so understanding these terms as they apply to this section is important. So the lowest floor is the lowest floor in the structure. It's the lowest enclosed area, which would include a basement or an unfinished floor or the crawl space floor. And so understanding that for section C is important, what we're talking about, and then we'll go through each of them. Whereas the first floor height for insurance is the height of the building's first floor that's above the adjacent grade. So different meanings, different definitions there. Again, with the top of the bottom floor, when we're talking about these things with surveyors, developers, or property owners, understanding these terms is important. We've had unintentional violations happen because people were unfamiliar with these terms and interpreted them differently from what we mean by something like top of the bottom floor. And the specific definition for a basement, all four sides are below grade, and the top of the bottom floor in that case would mean the basement floor. And we've had someone construct a basement and misinterpret that as being the ceiling of the basement. And so that structure had to be filled in and made compliant. And so that's the type of mistake that we want to avoid. And so having the elevation instructions And the building diagrams in there is a really helpful tool to surveyors and everybody involved with reviewing or filling out elevation certificates. And some professionals have thought they were helping people by entering false information, which is less likely to happen with risk rating 2.0 because the elevation certificate is optional and some things may not even be looked at, as it turns out. But as far as we know, for the new form, it will be updated and hopefully some things are clarified to also further help us to avoid any unintentional mistakes as we develop in the floodplain. So section C, this is the building elevation information. And if you were here the last couple of mornings, we covered section A, which is the building information, and section B, which is where the flood map information goes in. And so if you weren't able to attend those, we do have them recorded and we'll be posting them to our training page. And so C1 is what the building elevations are based on. So this is a type of elevation certificate that we have to review. It can be based on construction drawings, a building under construction, or finished construction. And of course, everything that we do for floodplain permitting has to be based on finished construction, but it can be useful to get these other elevation certificates before the building is completed to ensure compliance and to better work with the applicants to make sure that things are done compliantly in a time frame that we can more easily fix them than if it was just the finished construction. So that is an option that you can require that type of elevation certificate. So if it's based on the drawings, we can use that to verify that the plans are in compliance, and our accompanying inspections should also help us to verify that. Some communities have adopted building codes that ask for and after the foundation pouring elevation certificate. And then at that point is the best time to at least do one inspection. And if it needs to be corrected or elevated in that case, then it's a lot easier to do that before the construction is complete, because we do have some unfortunate stories where it's a lot more complicated and painful to fix it after those steps have already been taken. So oftentimes when a residential structure or other structures are under construction, a surveyor will initially be there and they'll put a stake in the ground and stake out the site and have them marked for the elevation that the floor needs to be at. And we did have about a $400,000 home that was constructed, and the surveyor drove a stake into the ground about 2 feet, and then it was marked that 2.4 feet is where it should be constructed to. And then a contractor misread it, and so that's another miscommunication that might be unavoidable to us, but it can happen, and then it was built too low. But I think an inspection with the surveyor and the developer or the contractor at the time that, again, the floor is being poured in, that's why that one's so important. That would have been a crucial moment that could have really helped them avoid that expensive mistake. Another thing that happened in Northeast Kansas is that a stake was driven into the ground and then the property owner came out and drove it in an extra foot. And so a lot of these mistakes can be attributed to just property owners themselves trying to take things into their own hand, if you've heard some of our stories over the past couple of mornings. But after they did that, the contractor came in and built to that level because that's how it was staked out. And then when the surveyor came out and remeasured everything, they knew that something had been altered. And then they had to change their finished elevation certificate to reflect the new elevations. And of course, that will make your the premium for them more expensive if they need flood insurance or if they want to have flood insurance. And so definitely something to look out for and take into consideration as we're reviewing certificates and maybe thinking about requiring the under construction or the building drawing elevation certificate. So again, C1 needs to be checked off so that we know what we're looking at. So this is a building under construction. We looked at it the other day. It's a drive-through restaurant that's unfinished. And some surveyors have had a different definition of what they mean by unfinished. So in one case, we had, no covers on the light switches or the sockets, but everything else was done, and they said it was still under construction. We don't really get involved in that. The surveyors are the licensed professionals that are certifying these documents, and so we kind of just go with what they say. But I think it's okay to let them know that they can consider it finished construction as soon as everything is structurally finished, because that's what we're looking at, and the foundation height, and that's what we need for compliance. So just something else to consider. And then the benchmark. So the benchmark is for C2, and it asks for the benchmark utilized and the unique identifier, and then the vertical datum. So definitely two important things to look at as we're reviewing these. So you may have seen some of the benchmarks that are out in the world. Sometimes they're embedded in bridges or trees or sidewalks. You can find them in different places in the city. And then we have a database of these NGS, or the National Geodetic Survey database, of where all of these maintained markers are. And so that has helped as we update things with digital maps, and as we move forward with technology, these things are well maintained, and we can look for them and find them on maps. Whereas if you're still working with paper maps, you might have older reference marks in your map notes. And so we'll take a look at that and how things may have changed over time since that map was produced. But there's 2 or 3 of these in the Wildlife Refuge in Emporia. I see them in Lawrence quite often. I always point them out. The marks should have a unique identifier number, and then they're registered with NGS. And this is the shift that FEMA has done, where they used to maintain the markers and everything, and now everything just says check with NGS for the benchmark and everything. So they should have that number, and then they're marked with a basic description. So in the older system, it might not say where it is. So if you don't know, again, you can go to this website and look it up. And so the vertical datum, NGVD or NAVD, again, it kind of depends on how old your map is. If it's much older, then it's probably an NGVD. Most of our maps since 2005 have been made in NAVD. So NGVD before 1988 was the system that was used nationwide, and it's based on mean sea level. And that was based on Coast Guard records. And over time, the coasts have changed, and they're different in the Great Lakes than they are in inland areas. And so it's just not as good of a measurement tool. So again, since 2005, we've switched datums for the maps. And so the datum is listed on the map. So just be sure to check that, check the box. We want to make sure that our section C datum is the same as our base flood elevation datum. They have to be lined up, and if they're not, that definitely needs to be fixed. So I'll show you a screenshot of this website. It's an interactive map, and you can get a full data sheet for each of these benchmarks. And again, they're maintained and registered here with the database so that you know that they haven't been moved or removed or lost, which is something to be concerned about with the older benchmarks. So this is the National Geodetic Survey website, and you can use the interactive map and look in different places, different communities to find their registered benchmarks. So yeah, just find your area and then you can find the benchmarks that used to be on the old maps. Again, FEMA stopped adding that information altogether and it's all through NGS now. There we go. So this is what it says in the map notes. Since that time, it just says to get in contact with NGS. Whereas it used to have the reference mark information. So it has their contact information there. This is an older style map for the city of Ellis, and this was updated last June. So this is not their current effective map anymore, but it used to say, you know, reference mark 1, and you have a flange of fire hydrant located on the northwest corner of this intersection, and then the other one is a nail in a fence post. And you know, as you know, cities are developed. They could have been moved. A fire hydrant could have been moved. That nail could have rusted out, or that fence could have been replaced by this point in time. Since the date of 1983 for sure, and maybe even before that as they were developing this map, and so it might be more difficult, but new construction in places that still have paper maps should be using the NGS benchmarks, and that way you don't have to rely on these as much. Although I have seen some areas on the interactive map that might not have so many benchmarks. So something to look out for, something to verify is definitely still there and still accurate. At least you have these descriptions to hopefully be able to go out and verify that it's still there. We've seen some descriptions in an elevation certificate where it just said it was based on a spike in a tree and didn't have any other information. So I doubt that's going to keep happening as we move forward with having these registered benchmarks, but just something to look out for. We also have the online positioning user service for surveyors. Again, technological advances. So this is a helpful tool for surveying. There's a space station signal that's captured by the surveyor, which might be easier for them to use. And so if they do use this method, there should be a report that is attached to the elevation certificate. It says to please attach that report in the elevation certificate instructions, which again, will likely be expanded with the new form and everything, and clarify what all needs to be done. So if you do see a note about Opus in the comments section, then we should make sure that we get the report that goes with this. And the Opus website through NOAA has information for surveyors and advice for best practices on clear weather days and maybe waiting a day to submit things, and the antenna calibration and how to avoid mistakes with this. So something else to be aware of if you're not familiar with Opus. And then again, the datum used in section C should be the same as B9. And so if they're in different datums, there is this conversion software. So it's not VertCon any longer, it's now NCAT, and I will show you another screenshot of that. But basically this graph shows you the difference between the two datums as we go from east to west. And so in Kansas, we're in this blue section. We're kind of in the middle of being impacted by it, but it can be up to 27 meters maybe in the east, which is almost 11 inches. As we go west, it's like 40 to 60. and that could be as much as 19.5 inches, about 20 inches. And so that kind of mistake, as we're doing new construction and reviewing elevation certificates, could be pretty significant. And if you were here yesterday, we were looking at mistakes on an elevation certificate where the base flood elevation was already wrong, and if they had compounded that mistake by having mixed datums, then it could have been even worse and more significant. So if they are different, they need to be converted, and then that information also needs to be in the comment section. So here's the NCAT software that's now used to do these conversions, and again, make sure that that is in the comments section if they had to mix datums. So section C2, we have A through H on this part. None of the spaces should be left blank. If it doesn't apply, we should have NA written on the line. And so we definitely want to compare these different items to the building diagram that's in A7. And that way we can verify that the diagram is correct. And obviously this is where we'd be verifying most of the compliance issues. And the building diagrams are in the instructions. So for top of the bottom floor, we did talk about that. It would be the basement floor, the crawl space floor, or just the top of the slab for a slab on grade. And if you're not sure, the diagrams are, drawn out, and then it points to exactly where these measurements should be taken from. Top of the next higher floor, that might be NA. If you have a one-story slab on grade, there's not a next higher floor. C2C is always NA in Kansas. That's for coastal areas, which we don't have. And then C2D is the attached garage. If there's no attached garage, put NA. And the attached garage should be sharing a common wall with the main structure. And that's what structurally attached means. If it's just a breezeway, it would be considered detached. And I do have a couple slides on detached garage towards the end. C2E is another thing that we verify for compliance. It's written into our regulations about how they should be elevated, and this is the lowest elevation of machinery and equipment. So even if it's up on the roof, that's something that has to be measured and recorded. Lowest adjacent grade, definitely something important if they're applying for a LOMA. So it turns out a lot of this stuff is not going to be used in risk grading 2.0. They're mostly looking at, the first floor height for that. And they're kind of on the honor system for the C2E machinery and equipment elevation mitigation credit. So they do have the option to get a discount on their insurance if it's elevated high enough, depending on their foundation type, but that might not be utilized even with an elevation certificate unless the underwriter is going in there and looking at it, which was surprising to me, but turns out that might be the case. And then highest adjacent grade is more important for section E, which we'll go over. And then C2H is the lowest adjacent grade of deck or stairs that are attached to the structure. And this number does matter for the LOMA. This number also needs to be at or above the base flood elevation for them to approve it. So sometimes a crawl space is really narrow, or it might just not have really anywhere to gain access to it, and we need to get these numbers. And so this is taken from the instructions on what to do if you have just limited access or it cannot be gained. They have these couple of different methods that we can use. So we can measure the height of the crawl space floor to the next higher floor and then subtract the height of the crawl space from that elevation, and then use the exterior grade to the structure to measure to the next higher floor. And so if you use any of these methods, it should be documented in the comments section. Really, every elevation certificate should have stuff in the comments section. And if it doesn't, they may not have been as thorough as we like. The floodplain administrators, so you as part of your application package might have the construction drawings that they can use to possibly document the crawl space floor. And sometimes the property owner has documentation or knows the height of the crawl space floor next to the next higher floor. So you can verify this by looking in through the flood openings. Sometimes you might have to go inside a structure to gain access to a crawl space. So obviously, if that's the case, you would want to be careful. Otherwise, if you're reviewing the elevation certificate, you just want to hopefully verify these things and get more information about how this measurement was obtained. If it's not explained in section D, again, the comment section, and we want to make sure that if we can't gain access, we look through the vents or try to find some way to at least see into this enclosure to make sure that there is not a basement situation or anything else that might cause problems. And so section C2, so we're back to the benchmark, utilize vertical datum, all of that. Again, C2C should always be marked NA for not applicable. It's only for V zones. And then we want to make sure that everything is documented in feet in Kansas. We did have someone use meters before, and then they had to redo the whole certificate because that's only for Puerto Rico. And obviously it's going to throw off all of the measurements. And so, yeah, they had to fill out a new one. And anything else that doesn't apply to A through H should also be marked NA. Like if there's no garage or no higher floor, it should be marked NA. And again, we should compare this to A7 and make sure that it lines up and they make sense. And, we have had discrepancies because sometimes it's a complicated building with mixed foundation types. So we just want to clarify that and have all of that documented in section D. So here are some common mistakes that we see in section C. C2A not using the basement floor, either by misunderstanding or intentionally incorrect, but that's not something I've ever seen intentionally done. C2B, so you have like a 2-story house where C2B, the next higher floor, is left blank, or it's for some reason written in as the same elevation as C2A, or you have a 1-story building that has something written into C2B that's not NA. C2C often left blank instead of NA. The attached garage is often put as NA or left blank. Again, if there is no garage, we want to see NA. None of this should be left blank. C2E left blank or not documented in section D. There should always be a description of what that machinery and equipment is in section D, and we'll get to section D. But again, even if the air conditioning system is on the roof, we need to have that measurement. And that's good if the underwriter does use this section for their mitigation and equipment, machinery and equipment discount. We're comparing the lowest adjacent grade C2F with B9 for the potential LOMA, and hopefully just letting people know about LOMAs and how they can be filed, and just trying to help out the citizens. And then the highest adjacent grade, C2G, is again more relevant for section E. And then C2H left blank when it should have not applicable or a number. And again, that's for the deck or stairs. So yes, C2A basement or cellar, even if it's unfinished floor, There have been mistakes made because it was an unfinished floor, but we need to be as accurate as possible. C2E, it doesn't really impact insurance anymore unless, again, the underwriter is using that for that discount. And then C2E needs to be explained in the comments, describe what it is. So yeah. Yep. Okay. So again, with the diagrams, from the Section A class, we went through all of these on Tuesday. It shows you where to measure these points, and so these can be helpful to have in the field as you're either filling out a certificate or as you're doing your inspections. And then just looking at these numbers and comparing them to each other can help us clarify mistakes that are made. So if you have the top of the bottom floor at like a 1010.4, and then the base flood elevation is 1007.6. So that does verify that the floor is above the base flood elevation, but the lowest adjacent grade is below the base flood elevation. And then you have it documented as like a basement. And we've seen elevation certificates turned in before where the basement is somehow not below the lowest adjacent grade. And so in that particular case, the pictures showed us the window wells in the foundation. And basically the person didn't put the bottom of the window well as the lowest adjacent grade, which again is a mistake. And I went over that part on Tuesday. So also comparing these numbers to the picture pages that are towards the end of the document can help us clear up any anomalies or mistakes that have been made. So if we know that there's a basement and it's underground and the lowest adjacent grade is somehow above that, we know that they've probably made a mistake. So again, comparing the structure to the diagrams and these illustrations, C2A is the top of the slab, C2B would be NA not applicable in this situation. And then of course the garage for C2D would be this clearly attached garage. The rear view, C2E, there's the lowest machinery and equipment. There it's this HVAC unit that's on a metal like rack outside. And then C2A, the top of the slab, you can see where it meets the floor. So for the machinery and equipment discount, it would have to be to the attic level or higher for that HVAC unit, which it's not. And then again, the lowest adjacent grade should be at the bottom of the window well. And then we did talk about intervening higher ground on Tuesday, which is going to be more applicable to Aloma than anything insurance related. It doesn't really matter for insurance. The same thing with the truck ramp. The lowest adjacent grade is at the bottom of the ramp because that's where the water is going to fill in, and that's where it's going to contact the foundation. And so the reviewers do make distinction between the natural grade and the concrete. They might not consider concrete covered ground as potentially intervening higher ground. That's more likely to happen with actual grade. So C2F is there, lowest adjacent grade, and then the comment section should explain the intervening higher ground. It might work for Aloma potentially. And then C2E, so we've talked about compliance with this section. So most of our concern here is with compliance. So the lowest machinery and equipment that services the structure. So this is a slab on grade, and you can see the structure is elevated, but the HVAC unit has been left on the ground. And after FEMA conducted a study, they realized they were paying out lots of claims on HVAC units that were left outside on the ground, even if the structure was elevated. And so they changed the rules for utilities in that we now have to make sure that utilities are elevated as much as the structure is. And that's written into our ordinances. Again, the machinery and equipment, under the old rating system, your rating floor could be changed if you had utilities on your actual lowest floor, and people were penalized for that, and that is no longer the case. You just don't get the discount if you don't have it elevated high enough. So the top graphic shows you where it needs to be elevated to for that discount depending on the type of structure it is. And so for building coverage and machinery and equipment, it's the AC, furnace, heat pump, water heater, elevator equipment, the things that make it livable. And the same thing with contents coverage, it would be clothes washer and dryer, food freezers, and the food in the freezers. So just kind of looking at this because it's still a compliance issue, and it would still be a violation of the regulations to just leave them on the ground. So again, it doesn't change the rating floor anymore. It used to. And the only question on the whole flood insurance application about the machinery and equipment is for the mitigation credits, which is a huge change from how it used to be. There's also these independent study courses available online for elevation certificates stuff. Some of this has been outdated. With risk grading 2.0, a lot of guidance and education is now outdated. So the 1105 is more about the lowest floor elevation, and 1105 and 1102 are more aimed at insurance agents. The 1103 for surveyors is less outdated because it's more about just how to fill these out. And, obviously this is still what we use for compliance. It's less about insurance focused information. And so it's mostly about your role in filling these out or reviewing them. It's helpful for that too. So just looking at first floor height again, just at the different diagram numbers and how it corresponds to flood insurance. Again, we're still waiting on this new form, so I think it's just going to clarify some of this. Slab on grades, it's the first floor. Anything with a basement, it's the floor above that basement. If it's a crawl space of any kind, it's the floor above the crawl space, as it's depends on if it's pre-firm or post-firm. Diagram 5, the elevated floor. 6, with the enclosures, it depends on if it's pre or post-firm. So that's 8, 9, 6, and 7. So just something to look at. You might want to look at the flood insurance manual just so you kind of see, but they've tried to make it clear how the elevation certificate relates to the rating floor. So people do have to just work with an insurance agent if they want to figure this out, and their premium and their final actuarial rates. Our rule of 1 foot of freeboard has not changed. I don't think there's any plan on changing that. We should just be encouraging people to elevate their structures as much as possible. It might be worth it to avoid a flood or get a lower premium. So looking at another elevation certificate, and some common mistakes that we see. So for A7, this is a diagram 2, which should say either A or B, so we know if it's a regular basement or a walkout basement. And then A9, there's an attached garage, and it says 900 square feet, but then it also says a crawl space that has no opening. So there is no mitigation credit for this, but it's also not compliant because they're in this case, they're calling the garage a crawl space, and there's not enough openings. So it should be 1 square opening per every square foot of enclosed space. And it also says there that it's within 1 foot above the adjacent grade. And then C2A is at 1179.5, and if we compare that to the base flood elevation, which is community developed, in this case, you can see in B10. So if this is correct, then the top of the bottom floor, which is some type of basement floor, is below the base flood elevation, and this was for a new building that was constructed. And so it's definitely too low. It's below the base flood elevation. And again, we have the 1 foot of freeboard rule for everybody. So this new building was built incorrectly, and then at least C2B at the very least is above the base flood elevation, so that's good. And then C2F, luckily the lowest adjacent grade is at 1181.8, so if everything here is correct, at the very least the lowest adjacent grade is above the base flood elevation, and they should file for a LOMA and hopefully include a sketch about the intervening higher ground that might help support the approval of that LOMA. And so again, getting a letter of map change is a valid way of dealing with these issues, and we've had them help us get out of compliance issues that would have otherwise required major retrofits and elevation of structures. And unfortunately, that does not change the premium anymore. So we used to have the preferred risk policy that is done away with. And so having that does not improve the premium, but again, it does take away the mandatory purchase requirement. And as I mentioned before, anything over 5 feet counts as a story. And so the distance there, it's not a crawl space. And then the elevated machinery and equipment, based on your structure type, it's a 5% discount. Having proper flood venting can be between 3 and 27% discount. And then there's a mitigation credit that's based on lowest adjacent grade, first floor height, foundation type, and I think structure type, like whether it's masonry like CMU, or if it's a stick-built structure, how many stories you have. There's just so many factors that go into these things to calculate a premium. But these are some discounts. There's still a lot of the other newly mapped discounts and other types of discounts that are available. So if you are unfamiliar with that, you should at least browse the flood insurance manual. And then for Section D, this should be signed and sealed with all of their information. And then there should always be comments in here. So usually there is not a mistake in this situation, but there are important comments about flood openings. So if there's engineered flood openings, that should be documented here with the certificate for those attached. A description of the lowest machinery and equipment for what it is, which would be C2E, or for E4. The benchmark information should be in here. The interior grade for openings, any datum conversion issues, and that description should be in there. Which sections were in what datum and what was converted, and that they use the NCAT software, and there might be documentation for that should be in there. And then any issues with the crawl space access, if they had to use a different than traditional method as per the instructions, should be in there. So there's lots of things to look for, depending on the specifics of the elevation certificate. Additionally, if it was an under construction certificate, how far along in construction was it? For G1, the data source. So again, that's for the community official to supplement the surveyor. So that information should be in there. Anything else not specifically asked for. So again, with the mixed foundation or any structural anomalies in there. And then if section E is based on natural grade, it should be and then anything else that needs to be explained in there. We have seen unusual building situations where there's like a deck with a sidewalk that has an area for parking underneath the building, where one side was a slab on grade, the other part a crawl space. That should all be explained, and then you can compare it to the pictures, and that should help verify any weirdness in there. And then they are signing and sealing this with their professional license, and so it's their best interpretation of the available data, and understanding that false statements could be punishable by law. So they are liable for this information. We think we may have seen purposely falsified information. I have not personally seen that. And we thought they were probably doing it for the insurance costs and stuff. But again, with risk rating 2.0, there's less of an incentive to do that. And I doubt that's going to be much of a problem. And so section E, again, new development has to have a base flood elevation, and it says here that it can be for zone A without the BFE. That does not apply in Kansas. We have a different rule that zone A, we have to develop a base flood elevation, and I'll show you that citation. But so this is for AO zone only. And for insurance purposes, a property owner can verify their own elevation certificate. So that's completely separate. We don't use that for compliance. We only use it for AO zones for compliance purposes, which our regulations say if there is no number for the AO zone, if there's no flood depth, then we use 2 feet above the highest adjacent grade. And so that's how we use this to verify compliance in AO zones. So you measure to the floor of the building, and it would have to be at least 2 feet or 24 inches. And then some of our communities, mostly CRS communities, have adopted some higher freeboard requirements in these zones. So it'll say if no depth number is specified, it'll be 2 feet above the highest adjacent grade plus 1 foot of freeboard. And that's for CRS communities that are in a class 8 or higher. Let me know if you have any CRS questions. But again, it doesn't require a survey, and it says that at the top. Again, we still require the 1 foot of freeboard in Kansas for the A zone, and so that base flood elevation has to be calculated. And I talked about some resources yesterday for getting BFEs in A zones, and we can help with that depending on where it is. And so if someone submits the elevation certificate for a risk rating policy, they are going to use the numbers that are most beneficial to the policyholders, whether that's with their rating tool or the certificate. And we've been getting mixed messages about how accurate the first floor height tool might be. So again, that's the typical language that you find in the AO zone. If no depth is specified, it's 2 feet above the highest adjacent grade. These zones are being phased out. We're trying not to have as many AO zones anymore. And it's never a bad idea to adopt additional freeboard to make sure that people are building new construction that's safe from flooding, or as safe as we can get it. And then here's the Kansas zoning regulations for the minimum standards and criteria that other states don't have, but basically it requires that in the A zone, we have to have a BFE calculated, and we still have the freeboard requirements. And then again, if you're in the CRS program at any level, you have your elevation and other construction certificates reviewed annually. And so this is the checklist that they send out for what has to be accurate, and you have to hit a 90%, and you get like 2 chances to get it to that level of accuracy. So if you would like a copy of this, I can send it to you. Again, if something is left blank or it's blatantly incorrect, don't accept it. Don't feel obligated to accept it. Withhold the permits, get it corrected, and I hope you feel comfortable working with and asking questions of developers and applicants, because it's more important that you make sure things are compliant than annoy people with making them comply with your regulations and everything. And if you need some backup, let us know. We're happy to help you support that enforcement of rules. And so the no right certificate is not part of the elevation certificate, but it is, required for any work in the floodway. And then going over these requirements with people can often deter them from wanting to develop there. And then elevating the structure, we do have some LOMAR F and LOMA classes coming up. Actually, we've combined them into one class, so I'll be sending out the newsletter later this morning with that information in it. But just being aware of how structures can be elevated on fill or on a crawl space with the foundation walls. That's part of the floodplain development permit, and fill would require a state permit, but just looking at this and helping people understand that they could get a LOMAR F and come out of the floodplain, not have the mandatory purchase requirement. Accessory structures, so they do have to have an elevation certificate if there are utilities, so that we can verify that they are properly elevated above the base flood elevation. Otherwise, they can be permitted without an elevation certificate, and then the permit will help us to verify that it's properly wet flood proofed. I also have a flood proofing class coming up where I talk about wet and dry flood proofing. And then you see a list of rules on the left side that apply to accessory structures. They have to be accessory and incidental in use to a primary structure. So here's an elevated one. The AC unit is elevated. And then the detached garage that I mentioned. So a detached garage can be exempt from needing insurance as part of a loan, and it won't need an elevation certificate unless, again, it has utilities in it, but it does still have to have a permit to be verified to be in compliance. And this would be considered an accessory structure, just like the shed I just showed you. So we want to read the instructions. These can help us answer a lot of questions about the elevation certificate, how to do it, how things should be documented. It can help you in review. You can call us if you need additional help, and definitely want to go through the instructions with the new form when it comes out eventually. So for more information, I put Tara's number there. She's the state coordinator. We have FEMA regional staff. They will usually refer you to us, so we should probably be your first stop. The FERMET and flood maps, that would be the FEMA Map Service Center, and I talked more about that yesterday for Section B, so check out the other recordings. There are lots of FEMA online publications, and I know I mentioned some of them being outdated, some of them are not. If you need any type of reference material from FEMA, I'm happy to help find the appropriate resource for that. The NGS benchmark stuff, if you have questions about benchmarks, that would be who to contact for sure. And then floodsmart.gov, that's a good resource. Get to know the local floodplain manager. If you're not the local floodplain manager, get to know the surveyors that work in your community. we have a demonstration video of Steve, my previous supervisor, kind of going through the elevation certificate with a model structure and how the different foundation types work, and then U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is at the bottom of that. So I'm always available, just like the previous days. If you'd like certificates, let me know. I know I haven't gotten the Section B ones out yet. We were out of the office most of the day yesterday, but I will get those out. If you'd like copies of the slides, and then yeah, let me know, and then I will be sending out that follow-up email with the new form once I get a hold of it. Okay, so whoops. Yeah, if you guys have any questions, doesn't look like there's much in the chat. But if you want to come off mute and ask anything, now would be a good time. Okay, well, if anything comes up later on, if you come across a situation, just let us know. We're happy to help with any elevation certificate questions or permitting or anything else floodplain related. So again, send me an email if you want any of these other materials. And other than that, I hope you have a great rest of your day.